All right. So with that, Rob, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to our panelists?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tony, thanks again for allowing us the opportunity to do to present a series of things around risk-enabled growth. We have some great people here to help have that conversation. As you mentioned, is a partnership of the group between Online Business Systems, Taurseer and RiskNeutral. Greg Kraft is a principal consultant within our risk, security, and privacy practice. He's got a very specific background within PCI, the secure software framework, and things that are very helpful for this particular topic. I'm a managing director within the risk, security, and privacy practice with Online. And if afterwards, if there's any questions about our organization, I'd be glad to help you out. I'd like to introduce Jeremy to talk a little bit about Taurseer and a little bit of his background.
Yeah, so Jeremy Vaughn, CEO and co-founder of Taurseer. We are a continuous product portfolio, risk management, and assurance platform.
And Jeff?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Just want to extend my warm welcome and thank you for taking some time today. My name is Jeff Santry. I'm the CEO of RiskNeutral. We're a boutique consulting firm that spends a considerable amount of time with the C-suite and board of directors, helping them to develop enterprise risk management programs.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Then we'll get on with the presentation. So, Tony, I'm going to try to see if I can work the technology here.
Go for it.
Turn this over and perfect. All right. I'm assuming our screen is working really well for everybody.
Looks good.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. I always like to do that check. You never know with different technology. So again, why are we here? This part of a series of presentations that our partnership was bringing together. And this particular topic that we're talking today is kind of the why question. Why you need or should create a risk optimized organization to achieve strategic and capitalize on that digital growth opportunities that are presented there. And Jeff is going to lead us into that first part of the conversation, talk a little bit about some of the common growth strategies, and then we'll dive further into the presentation. So Jeff, all to you, sir.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so kind of kick this off, I just want to frame the conversation. This is really kind of designed to be kind of executive level, C-suite level. Probably for a lot of us, part of the challenge is just making sure that when we interact with our C-suite and board, that we're discussing things at the right level with the right terms. And so I thought we would maybe frame this conversation about something they always love talking about, which is growth. And so from my perspective, I saw a speaker a couple of years ago that said, hey, there's really 5 core ways to grow your business. And so I thought maybe we would start there and then focus on a couple of these as we kind of walk through a scenario. So the first one that a lot of people, think that they're going to be pretty good at and is easiest because it's something that's done internally, is that most people think, hey, let's just stick to our guns. Let's, know what we're good at, stay in our lane, and we'll enable organic growth with our organization using our existing products. We'll introduce some new things, or maybe we'll just expand our current line to increase our capacity. And so we'll grow the top line by just increasing our product line or our manufacturing capacity, for example. The next thing is, I don't think many people do this very well. I find most people, when they have a budget, like, hey, let's spend everything and a little bit more, and we'll put a lot of bets out there in the world to see what comes to fruition. But I really think part of being having a risk trade-off mindset and having a risk-aware organization is that you can't always, fuel everything that you want to from a priority perspective. So some of the best organizations that I've worked with have taken resources away from lower growth potential initiatives and fully funded the big bets. And I think this is just kind of a discipline and execution component. The next thing is just create new revenue streams or business models where they didn't previously exist. Now, some people call this like the blue ocean effect. And the reality is these are extremely rare and extremely hard to do. So I put it out there because I acknowledge it. But again, I don't think it's the one we go to most of the time. The third or the fourth is just expanding to a new geography or leveraging new marketplaces. So let's say you're a North America bound company and you're like, hey, I think we should grow into Europe and Asia. So that's another way to just increase and grow. And then the latter is kind of the effect to your competitor, is you could just gain market share at your competitor's expense. So you could do that by adding additional value, lowering your costs or something like this. But I really see this as being the 5 common ways to grow your business. So what we wanted to focus on today, instead of just leaving it being that broad, is that we find that most people find it's pretty tough to pull, especially like number one off. So most people choose in this day and age, because there's a lot of powder on the street and a lot of capital available, to do mergers, acquisitions, and then hopefully a good job at the integration, so that they can maybe buy somebody that's doing something particularly well and bring that in-house, and then try to look for ways to exploit that and make it a little bit more profitable or help grow the business. So the reality is that we're going to talk specifically in kind of a general scenario about merger, acquisitions, and integration. But I think what we're going to talk about today is generic enough that if you chose one of the other growth strategies, that the lessons learned would be equally valuable. Rob, next slide. So we were going to talk about digital transformations. And so we, instead of just pulling from the headlines or talking about a case study or something that's been in the headlines and picking on one company, we're like, hey, why don't we just make this a little bit more generic, and then kind of focus our comments on maybe some stuff we've pulled from the headlines, but not name individual companies. So we're introducing this concept here that on the top of this business timeline, these are kind of corporate growth events. So this is what the C-suite and the board of directors is probably involved in, and says, hey, I want you guys to do this. This is your new marching order. This is what I want to have happen in terms of executing against our strategy and actually achieving our growth goals. And then down below are some organizational responses or industry responses for this. So in this particular case, we could have maybe somebody that was a traditional brick and mortar retailer that says, you know what, we're doing a great job. We're killing it with our stores. We're doing a lot of business via cash, but we really think we're missing the boat, and we don't have a digital platform to produce some of our content on that's moving more to the digital realm. So in many cases, content delivery is going digital. Everyone kind of recognizes the market trend. The board responds by authorizing the acquisition of maybe a platform as a service, start going around, shopping around, find some initial acquisitions. Hopefully they get the one or two things they really wanted to kind of build this new platform around, and then they go ahead and acquire it. So in most cases, we find that growth initiatives, people tend to pick one and then stick with it over time. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if, for example, the mindset was let's pick up a platform as a service, and now let's just add additional stuff onto it so we can increase our revenue streams. But I think that's important here down below is that anytime we kind of shift our revenue streams, kind of the attack surfaces and the bad guys try to exploit that. So for example, as many people were picking up like platforms as a service or doing like dedicated networks for gaming platforms and stuff like this, then we started seeing business interruption and revenue impacts from things like denial of service attacks. So things are marching on. Corporate growth is still going the way it wants to. We leverage the platform for content delivery. But sometimes we get the execution wrong. And so down here at the bottom, this is where maybe we roll something out on the platform as a service, but it doesn't go particularly well, and it might, cost us customers. Or maybe just old customers aren't on board with it and they say, hey, I really like your retail stores. I'm not too keen on you guys selling everything online. So there could be some customer exodus. You don't execute everything properly. Next thing that tends to happen is, hey, things are going good. Brand new revenue streams, you start to exceed things like growth, year-over-year growth targets, and then the board and the C-suites patting themselves on the back, thinking they did a great job. But then other things start to happen that maybe aren't as awesome, such as the source code for your platform as a service being exposed, or somebody stealing all your customer information or the payment information or something like that, publishing it on the web, and that really not doing very well. Which you can see here, the net result in many cases will be that there's a revenue drop. So this is just kind of like, we think everyone could kind of paint this picture probably for their organization, some highs, some lows, and some industry, as well as detrimental events. And so we're going to dig into those a little bit more. Rob, next slide. So in this particular case, one of the first tenets that we think most organizations that are trying to create a risk optimized organizations are that leadership teams need to develop a risk optimized organization. So in this particular case, we're shifting a little bit, and you can see these are now swim lanes. So it's kind of a mirror image of from the top to bottom, kind of initiatives, talents, process, and assets. These are kind of swim lanes, but you can see on the top, if we do something particularly well, we'll kind of give the organization a little bit of credit for it. But if they've kind of missed something that they should be a little bit more mindful of, we put that down on the bottom. So in this particular scenario where we think an organization should buy a platform as a service to launch digital content, we see that the board says, hey, fantastic, you guys go buy a brand new, shiny platform as a service. Let's start digitizing as many products as possible. I give you some money, I give you the green light, go ahead and go do it. So everyone's like, hey, this is cool. This is a brand new shiny object. We're, a brick and mortar retailer that's largely done cash. So everyone clamors to get on the due diligence team to get on board with this strategic program and be part of the pursuit team. But I think one of the realities is that if it's the first time you've done something, that down in the bottom, maybe lack of experience and skill sets evaluating platforms as a service might be problematic, because maybe you are really good at building brick and mortar stores and handling cash, but if you've never built a platform as a service, or you haven't done a whole lot with digital payments, it could be a little problematic. So the acquisition happens, we go to the next slide, we part with some cash, we pick up some cool people, and now we start with the integration. And so now we find some gems. Hopefully we did our due diligence well, even though we had a team that didn't have a lot of experience with platform as a service. But what we hopefully get is some newly acquired developers, QA people, maybe even some architects and some people with a solid app dev and security skill set. So from a talent swim lane perspective, maybe that looks really good. Next thing we get the new platform as a service and we're like, oh man, this is cool. We can start serving stuff up and selling things this way. But what if we started doing things like upselling and cross-selling stuff on the platform, so that while people were interacting with it, we could have all these incremental revenue bumps. And so we start looking for things in addition to the platform as a service. We start looking for things like new capabilities, like digital payment capabilities, to create new sales channels. But again, I think the risk here is that if you don't have a lot of experience with things like digital payment, sometimes if you don't have the right staff, you can get into problems where maybe the products are flying off the digital shelf, if you will. But now you've got to worry about new things like industry requirements, like the payment card industry data security standard that Rob and Greg have a lot of experience in. So I think the risk here is that if you got a lot of experience in a different type of sales model, when you take on a new sales model, there might create some blind spots because you just don't have experience in the space. Next slide, Rob. Then things are going along. Board's pretty happy. You've acquired the new digital platform and you've done some really cool things. And this is what people tend to think about when they think about mergers and acquisitions. They think about the upside. When we went from these brick and mortar stores and being a big cash, handling organization, to we've now acquired a digital platform and we've got a new set of customers, or we've reduced things like customer concentration. Oftentimes what you'll also see with the M&A discussions is they want to talk about efficiencies or integrations. And so here, maybe the platform as a service allowed them to license and sell products digitally that they were doing maybe via DVD or something like that, to age myself a little bit. But now they've, in addition to having these new revenue streams, they've also done things like reduce their physical storage capacity because it's expensive to build things like warehouses, or I think very timely, maybe there's less sensitive to things like supply chain issues. So again, I think the first step is that organizations, as they take on new business models, need to be mindful of maybe some of the risks that they don't have a lot of experience in and they're not good at evaluating. Rob, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. So next we're talking about is a little bit some of the mega trends that are occurring within the industry and with the space, specifically in the digital marketplace, right? They're trying to take more products and try to gain those particular synergies to leverage some of the initiatives and talents that the board has identified. So as Jeff has kind of mentioned, as through the acquisition, integration, optimization phases of this, we move into the trends. What kind of trends that are doing this to bring these things together? Maybe an organization would have a different platform doing different types of video type of activities, or a kind of a brick and mortar type of scenario where they had a little bit of that e-commerce site, and they're trying to leverage some of those customers to be able to gain those synergies of those customers coming from that revenue stream, to synergize them and leverage them and those initiatives and talents over to, and the people over to the different platforms that be able to combine those things. So the board will see different types of trends, accumulate those things into different types of activities, and then leverage those initiatives and the talents that they potentially have to get to be able to capture on those trends that are coming to the marketplace, specifically within the digital marketplace there. But one of the reverse sides of the kind of the opposite side of that is, as you kind of increase your utilization of different trends to try to capture on those things, it really expands the attack surface that you potentially could bring into. And if you already have kind of, you've been going this thing, everything's going fast, everything's going fast, everything's going fast. You acquire, you integrate, you're trying to optimize, but if you have poor cyber hygiene within the organization, it just compounds those issues even further in that. So as you try to optimize the risk that's associated, you try to keep yourself closer to that line so that you are doing that. And in the brick and mortar side of the house, or even in some of the past, you got mounting different types of technical debt that's associated with that, right? And if you don't understand as you go through the due diligence phase, you go in and say, okay, I like this organization. Part of the tracking team or due diligence team, if you don't include either some form of security within that inner circle to be able to do part of that, or some of the IT functionalities that are there, you bring that new organization in, you start to integrate them, and then all of a sudden there's this new risk that presents into the organization that probably wasn't realized within that initial phase of things. So there may be some assets there or processes that are there that are causing that. So those are the kind of things that you want to kind of the tick for the tat, be able to watch out for when you're coming in from a mega trend, from the different types of trends that are out there. The second part of this activity in this area is around the value creation that's key to gain the synergy within the talent and tangible assets, is gaining shareholder or stakeholder trust. Organizations, when they can get existing assets and process, they got to be able to drive that growth, which then drives that trust. It makes you want to utilize those systems or processes or organizations in the digital marketplace more and more. If you've got the trust and be able to understand that, making a payment through a digital marketplace and have that capability, understanding that the logistics is going to be there, and all of a sudden have a package or your product be able to show up at your door. This is gaining the trust that the organization is making those moves against those initiatives and aspects. And that's all about the processes that they have underneath there. And the thing that occurs most of the time in this activity is a loss of crucial talent. As you kind of gain the organizations, you start making that move together. Specifically, the organizations that are there are strategic risks that could impact the organization's ability to deliver against those. You are combining different cultures. You're combining different geos. You're combining different activities where the people are the core part of the organization, moving from the left to the right to be able to get those things. Those talent in this marketplace, specifically in this pandemic year, is key. In being able to hang on to that talent is a key driver to be able to make those activities going forward, and it should be looked at here. So to be able to draw that closer, to be able to identify those risks, to be able to do that, to have that understanding is key in that particular move as you move from the left to the right of the timeline. All right, Greg.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Rob. I'll be talking about, systemic risk treatment and how that enables a culture that minimizes deviation from the expected outcomes. And in doing that, I'm kind of focusing the context of these slides in the acquisition of a possibly cursed streaming technology stack and how that relates to the business as usual activities of a mature systemic risk program and the incorporation of those new acquired assets into the parent company. So I'll kind of precursor this with the premise that an ineffective product management program and poorly implemented or non-operationalized business as usual processes impact the ability for organizations to achieve their expected outcomes and consequently introduce risk. The expected outcomes themselves could be regulatory expectations, they could be compliance goals, they could ultimately be customer retention and shareholder value. And poorly implemented programs affect the ability of an organization to understand and quantify that risk. And consequently, they don't offer opportunities to address the risk or improve the overall posture. And to simply put it, I always say you don't know what you don't know. So all the assets within an organization, whether they are tangible or intangible, should form part of a holistic systemic risk program that allows the organization to gain the required visibility into the ongoing and reoccurring process of product development life cycles. In the longer term, the overall improvement and delivery of the products that it provides to the market is also achieved. If you consider these factors in the case in point relating to the streaming technology stacks, there was a few evident takeaways that we could establish, and that the case considers the lack of the organization to absorb their newly acquired entity, and along with that, their associated product sets into an established program within the parent organization. It highlights that regardless of the size of the mothership or the vastness of the resources that are available, a poorly implemented program would still present a considerable challenge in delivering their expected outcomes. The lack of the maturity within the process of onboarding the acquisitions, that includes the tangible and intangible assets, the talent pool itself, and the existing risk culture into the parent organization, resulted in the poor product management practice to produce a considerably negative impact to the organization. The lack of the statistical data-driven information within an immature systemic risk program also allowed for minimal overall improvement in the process or methodologies, and denied their insight into the undetermined risk that was sort of waiting in the wings for them. You could go to the next slide there, Rob. A well-defined and mature systemic risk program provides a considerable amount of knowledge power, which can be leveraged by the executive teams within their decision-making process. It provides insights into the, not only to the executive, but to the product owners and the participants within those product platforms itself. The capacity to create the view of the associated risk related to the product or the product family allows for an organization to react proactively and thereby minimize their potential impacts. So I kind of consider or ask guys to consider the process of developing a single product, right? And which is possibly used within multiple platforms. And then additionally consider the process of the development lifecycle that has to take place, the location and the accessibility of the repositories that needs to be there by all participants, and whether there's embedded and mature vulnerability management initiatives in place within those systems. And within the life cycle of the product itself, we've got to consider, the functions that might change, vulnerabilities that could be introduced, code libraries that could be merged, and talent within those organizations that's often rotated in and out of the environment itself. And those considerations should be forming part of what our observability is. They should, form part of the process alignment within our product development lifecycle and within the systemic risk programs. So the lack or inability to understand or quantify the many factors ultimately creates a massive blind spot of undetermined risk. The lack of insight as well into all of the elements or processes and the people responsible for the overall delivery of the product become increasingly challenging as the product sets increase by either organic growth, by acquisition, or where the products share common resources and repositories and functions between them. So by incorporating the adoption of all of these assets into a holistic product management and systemic risk program that incorporates visibility into the product development, visibility into the product ownership, and correlation of shared functions and services, and also ensures accountability by the participants, management would be provided insight into what we would call a product-centric view. This allows organizations to consider all of the risk impacting factors affecting the ongoing process of providing a secure product into the market. It allows organizations to develop products to establish a baseline of assurance and trust in a product, and it's developed within a quantifiable framework. And it allows organizations that have effectively implemented a mature program to meet the further objectives and outcomes that they encounter, such as compliance initiatives, regulatory requirements, and they all require definitive data-driven auditable results. And collectively, they allow the organization to meet those expected outcomes by proactively addressing challenges in a repetitive and measurable way, which ultimately translates at the end of the day into growth and shareholder value. And on that note, Rob, I will pass over to a scholar and a gentleman, Mr. Jeremy Vaughan. He's got a very unique way and provides deep insight into challenging operations that large enterprises face every day, and you're going to love his visionary approach.
Thank you, Greg. So, all right, so we've rolled through the layers of strategic decisions where things look good on paper. The reality of these things is in execution, they do start to converge with your digital assets. So let's talk about that. And that's what the next 3 slides are about. In this particular scenario that we studied the case on, the company led 7 acquisitions over 5 years, right? So that means the first integration couldn't have been completed before introducing the next. It's very risky. Within all of these firms that they've acquired, including the acquiring firm, there's different skill sets, there's different work streams, there's different tech stacks, and various levels of process maturities. And I saw a lot of tech people join the call, so you're really starting to get into the nuts and bolts here. The complexity, so therefore, and the risks are compounded with each acquisition and converging all of these skills and assets together. This brings up a good point, though. In the due diligence process, not having a very diverse team in the due diligence process really introduces unnecessary risk into the transaction, because blind spots were not revealed until after the acquisition was complete. So in this case, it does appear cybersecurity risk management capabilities were not appropriately considered here. And so, for example, and Rob mentioned it earlier, poor hygiene. There are risks that exist in most companies today and can easily be exploited. And so when we're talking about capitalizing on these opportunities, these are things that get in the way of the growth strategy. So, and you see them in a lot of the case studies out there today in the headlines. Poor configuration management, as seen in this particular case that we're picking on today. Inefficient management of administrative privileges. A big one, which is being very exploited, the inability to gain risk insight into the processes or the tools that we're using to deliver product. It's seen here, and it's seen in many large cases over the last 2 years, including this year. Your own unmanaged code rot, open source vulnerabilities, shadow IT, your secrets in code that go undetected or lack context when they are detected. And then finally, there's no visibility or governance around any of these things that I mentioned. And Rob, you can go to the next slide. So let's go down another layer. Now we're getting into developing programs. The organization wants improvement. They hire the right leadership, develop product security programs, and they're wanting to align the technologies, processes, and activities with the objectives and the overall strategy of acquiring these firms to achieve that business growth. Improvement includes everything around what Greg said, the product's entire life cycle, and the risks due to insecure, unchecked, or unmanaged behaviors, processes, and technologies. What we realized in what we're talking about here is this is really impossible without context. And Greg was really hinting on product operations, product management, very mature programs. The cost of neglecting visibility and understanding of risk in this context, we see it over and over again. It leads to disaster, but this can be achieved. And Greg had it up on the top lollipop there, product ops. What we're talking about here is building a very contextual, dynamic, real-time product inventory. What this does is contextualize your bill of materials with all of your dependencies, outdated components, and associated vulnerabilities. It essentially fingerprints contributor activity and behavior to specific products and its supporting infrastructure. This allows you to detect contextual configuration differences or changes when they happen in real time, and appropriately prioritizing the risks so the right teams can focus on the right things at the right time. And last but not least is integrating more capabilities in this strategy as your risk program matures over time. And then Rob, next slide. And so what we did is really wanted to focus in on accountability. This isn't a one man or woman show. This is a organizational movement. And so right now, most companies are operating in a very dangerous, what I call catch me if you can mindset. And as an example of that is, if you look back on Home Depot or Zoom, for example, they took the time to fix their issues while putting other work on hold. That's really good. That's a really great practice. Because on the other side of things, the high profile examples that you've seen this year only did this after being caught. So while we get into product centric risk context, it's not just about developers. It's not just about tools. Everybody in the organization needs access and visibility to work together and avoid risk. With context and this product-centric view, everyone gets continuous feedback and accountability. And this is really what we're trying to achieve here, is that systemic risk treatment from top to bottom, so we can actually protect that business growth. And so achieving this, we see the result is much more higher quality and better informed decisions across all of your teams from top to bottom and at the portfolio and product levels. This allows risk ownership to be spread across the entire organization and now align specific people that are working on specific things with the business objectives and align with their growth goals. And with that, I will definitely shift this over to Jeff to wrap it up.
Yep. Rob, stick on this slide for 3 seconds. So as I transition into the next, the final component of the presentation, what I want to just highlight about this visual is the fact that, you know, the senior management team, the board of directors typically sees the stuff above the line. It's the stuff in green. We made more money. We acquired new customers and stuff like this. But I think what you have to do as senior leaders is just not necessarily say, hey, there's not downside or risk, but understand in many cases, there's something above the line that's really good, but there's also risks that are probably being introduced with new capabilities. And I think this is one of the things that we justify, for example, saying, hey, you know, the CISO or a member of his or her team should be part of the pursuit team. You know, somebody that's working on our cloud infrastructure, if we know that's a critical component for onboarding someone, should participate. And I think we've said it a couple times here, having a cognitively diverse pursuit team as it leads to mergers, acquisitions, integrations, and then eventually optimizations is just incredible. So the reason we spent the time to walk you through this is that, you know, everyone probably has a different perspective based on their viewpoint of the mergers and acquisition process, but the integration is actually part of the hardest parts. And I think if everyone would just take a little time to educate the senior leaderships on what some of the potential risks are, I think the integrations would go much smoother. So Rob, let's go on to the final piece of content here.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. I mean, I think that's the point of the aspect of things is the risk-enabled growth, right? As you pull closer to the risk and pull the growth through, you can minimize the levels of the downside risk and bring it back to more of an optimized approach to it, which I think is what you're going to bring it home with, sir.
Yep. All right. So this is this final slide is just a perspective on potentially how to frame the conversation related to this topic. So, you know, the board and the C-suite ultimately require adequate visibility to provide sound governance on current and emerging risk. And, you know, I really see this kind of coming in 5 core areas. I seem to be debates all the time about what different risks are. Oh, Jeff, there's credit risk, there's this risk, there's fraud risk. But in reality, I would ask everyone to just really maybe focus on the 5 core risks that I think is appropriate for the C-suite and the board level. That's strategy risk, which is by far the most important. I'm sure you'll have different people maybe have different opinions on this. I can tell you, we can back it up with strategies and findings. If you get the strategy wrong, a whole bunch of other things don't matter. Then most things fall into operational risk, how well we execute things, how well we do things like retain talent. I think finance is pretty self-explanatory. Compliance, I think, whether this be regulatory like PCI or a particular industry you're in, or maybe the publicly traded exchange that you're on comes into place. But again, almost every organization has some type of compliance risk, even if it's just simple stuff like maybe OSHA or EPA regulations. And then finally, the way I describe the 5th element of core risk is if you get any of the first 4 wrong, you're probably going to impact the 5th type, which is reputational. So we really ask people to focus on the 5 core risk areas. And the way I explain this slide relatively simply is I start at the bottom with enterprise-wide risk. And the way I look at this, there's really kind of 3 quadrants. And down in the bottom, this is really where the C-suite and the board have some input and have some control to create a risk optimization. So down in the bottom, from an enterprise-wide perspective, we think that what they're trying to achieve is that green area, which is creating the maximum value. And what they're trying to avoid is strategy not being realized. This happens all the time. We talked about some of the missteps that you can make as part of the integration process. And if you don't get that right, then all of a sudden your strategy kind of falls apart because you can't achieve the results that you probably use to justify the acquisition in the first place, that might tip over once you actually start bringing products and talent in, and you can't quite get the juice out of them that you needed. So from an enterprise-wide perspective, I really think the board and the C-suite needs to focus on 3 things. One is a ubiquitous mission. Everybody has to understand a risk a risk-enabled mindset. So we talk about things like 3 layers of defense, where we've got people on the front line taking risk every day, setting pricing, interacting with customers that are overseen by the second line, which is typically internal audit, and then the management team overseeing the first line, and then you've got this third line of defense that really focuses on like the board of directors and internal audit. But everyone's got to have the same mindset. And people are like, well, Jeff, this is only a big company topic. It isn't. For a small company, this is just, hey, what's the tone at the top? Are we safety conscious? Are we image conscious? But you've got to have everyone on the same page here and understand what the risk appetite is, which is typically set by the board of directors and should be well understood by everyone in the organization. The next thing is aligned resources. This is kind of what we hinted at before. So if you're going to do something like acquire a platform as a service for the first time, you better have some people or hire some people as hired guns to come in and help you evaluate those and talk to you about what some of the integration challenges might be. So aligned resources, everything from having the right talent inside, pulling on the right resources, and maybe even looking at board composition to make sure you've got board directors that actually are aligned with your growth strategy so they can help you make some of these strategy decisions. And then finally, I think this is a real opportunity for people to enable their growth, is if the organization spends the time looking at things like their KPIs and their KRIs, especially with things like software-defined architecture. This is an awesome way to get your arms around having orchestrated oversight so that everyone's looking at things in context, which Jeremy and Greg both spent a lot of time talking about. So down in the bottom there, we talk about the enterprise-wide viewpoint, and this is basically what the organizations can do. I move up to the left and basically say risk management's a team sport. So in this particular case, people in our industry want us to be good industry partners. So, what we're really trying to do is establish good value for our stakeholders. So we want to have an acceptable level of exposure to risk, but we also don't want to be blindsided. So I really think this is where the industry perspective comes in. And so what we need to do is look at things like, let's just start with what are our tangible and intangible assets. I think Jeremy and Greg both spoke about this. If you're going to go acquire a company, much less 7 and 5 years, you better be able to do things like say, hey, what are the facilities that you have? Who's the key talent that's there? Those are probably on the physical asset side. But then from an intangible asset side, you need to be like, how many applications do you have? Where are your code repositories? How do you handle open source vulnerabilities? And so getting a good handle on the tangible and intangible assets is probably step one. And I think everyone in the industry would probably agree. The next thing we want to do is maybe take it and going from general conversations about the entire landscape of threat and the entire capabilities of the organization, and really kind of help the board and the C-suite by taking core threats and core responses and taking them down to a scenario. I think this is extremely important, and it's tied very closely to quantifying the financial impact. So from an informed scenario response, this is where I think we rely on our industry partners and our public partners. So this is like, hey, maybe go join an ISAC specific to your organization, get insight and feedback from your InfraGuard chapter about what's going on in your industry. What types of attacks are you under? What are the bad actors doing? What are some of the trends you need to be aware of? And use that to inform the scenario response that you explain to your C-suite and board members. And then finally, I think a lot of people shy away from this because it's a little bit of a heavy lift, but we need to start quantifying the financial impact. And I really think there's 2 recommendations here. One is we start using things like fair analysis so that we can actually analyze what's the impact and the results of a particular scenario, and then utilize things like actually creating an internal loss database. So when a bad event happens, like we do have a ransomware attack, we capture all those costs so we can go back to the board and we want to lay out 2 scenarios, maybe for like ransomware response, and say, hey, two good ways we could kind of help curb this is either have better backup and recovery capability or implement multi-factor authentication in more places. But if we were able to quantify the financial impact for that very specific scenario for board members and say, hey, this one will cost, A will cost this much and B will cost this much, I think the relationship with the board and the C-suite would change dramatically. And then finally, on the right-hand side, if we get the industry stuff and we're good industry partners, where we're both sharing information as well as taking it in to inform our response and how we build our risk management program, the rewards come on the right-hand side with the market-driven response. So what we're really trying to do is be the market leader. We're trying to stay out of the headlines. We're trying to be that applications is back on our heels, blaming stuff on interns that were in over the summer. And we really want to have market leading growth. And I really think that's just the market rewarding you for good governance and good behavior. And the one thing you don't want to become is somebody that's just headline fodder, which is becoming a marginalized provider. I think we've seen this many, many times where someone that doesn't govern themselves correctly ends up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or is in the headlines for the wrong reason because they had their source code published, or they had credit cards released on their customers, or they just had a PII released as part of a healthcare provider. I think this is where you become a marginalized provider as a downside of not adequately doing good governance at the board and C-suite level. So as Rob mentioned, I think every organization has the ability to exploit megatrends. And these are everything from what Rob highlighted, which is like, hey, let's shift stuff from brick and mortar and physical inventory to digital inventory. But I think the upside is that every organization has to look at risk as both opportunity risk that can be taken advantage of, or not always looking at it from the standpoint of it's something that should be avoided or mitigated with things like insurance. So for example, another one's like just talent. There's going to be a shortage of talent. There's probably going to be travel restrictions. There's probably going to be supply chain issues and stuff like this. But the people that understand what those are, what the core components are, and can figure out how to leverage that and adjust their growth strategy will be far better off. The next thing you have to do, especially in the digital age and with the age of social media and everything else, is you have to continuously earn shareholder trust. So this is things like feedback loop. This is like having a crisis management response. So when something goes bad, you don't have a press release. You don't have a press conference a month after your entire customer database has been compromised and the Wall Street Journal and Krebs has posted it on his blog post and be like, oh, by the way, a couple months ago, something bad might have happened. The reality is that this is where you have to continuously earn shareholder trust, use things like feedback loops, get people like crisis management teams involved. So if something bad does happen, you're out there in front of it and you're controlling the messaging. And then finally, I think really importantly is if you do these other two things correctly and you have more control over your data and your infrastructure, you're able to do risk-based pricing. So like a simple example I can give you is, let's say, for example, you're trying to rent a car. But the car company knows like, you know what, I've got some cars that have recalls in them. So I can either charge you a premium and rent you a car that has no recalls on it for you and your family to be as safe as possible. Or I can give you the little bit of a discount level, which I think you're going to be fine. I can't even get parts to fix the things that are broken anyways, but I'll give that to you at a reduced price. So I think risk-informed pricing is this other thing that once you have a good control on your risk program, you can actually charge different prices based on risk being introduced by either your suppliers or by your customers. So let's say, for instance, you've got an ecosystem where you have suppliers that are just, maybe not as buttoned up as they should be. Well, then maybe they don't get your greatest discount, or maybe they don't get preferred pricing. But the reality is that if you do your risk management programs correctly, then you can start doing things like actually adjusting your pricing to account for your amount of risk. And what the really important point here is that it is only in pricing is the only opportunity you have to transfer risk to your customers or to your suppliers. But finally, to wrap this all up, is a really important thing at the top here is that minimizing deviation from expected outcomes is highly valued by your key stakeholders, whether it be industry partners, that could be people in your supply chain, that could be competitors and people you cooperate with, or on the market side where they're like, you know what, I like your good behavior. I like your mindset about protecting me, my data, my assets. So I'm going to reward you and I'll be willing to pay a premium for your product and services. So this is just kind of a framework that we can use that we think is kind of three legs of the stool. That's a little bit more about how we should maybe explain to senior management why they need to get behind creating a risk optimized organization versus doing other stuff which might introduce more risk into the enterprise.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. So we're bringing to the conclusion. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we were sitting here talking about how or why you want to create that risk optimized thing, which Jeff just concluded with, and the rest of the team. The next part of the series is how. How do we create this, right? And so we've scheduled a webinar. That webinar is going to be on November 10th at 1 p.m. East Coast time. Everyone that's registered through the process here will get an email probably in the next day or two with the link to be able to register for the specific series. And then going into 2022, we're looking to do one per quarter per se around this topic. And so we really do appreciate your time and effort to come. I know it takes time to get in the busy day to come to a presentation. We really appreciate that. And Tony, I think there's maybe some other things that you need to to wrap up with as well, or?
Off. We have one question. It just popped up. So is that okay with you guys? We'll just
Yeah.
All right. So the question was, most people start leaving acquired entities. How do you manage the risk of that? More monitoring, more clawback contracts, more people integration before tech integration, risk of, I guess, people resources.
Yeah, Rob, you want me to take that? Take a stab at it?
Yep.
So I think the reality is the way to answer that question is I think as more and more of the merger and acquisition targets become intangible assets, which incidentally is how all GAAP accounting is set up. How many buildings do you have? How many trucks do you have? How much inventory is still left on the shelf? The challenge is that the mergers and acquisition, integration, and pursuit teams need to have different skill sets. So if you, for instance, know you're going to acquire applications, then you need to have people on staff that are really good at analyzing applications so they can do things like determine how much of this application we're purchasing is actually open source code and wasn't written. How much of this is really secret sauce that they actually coded? Have they either by accident or intentionally embedded code that we owe a royalty to somebody? So it's just an example of to what Rob was saying on that one slide about having a cognitively diverse pursuit and evaluation team. As we acquire more and more things that are things like business models, algorithms, software building materials, and intangible assets, we need to update the skill set of the people evaluating those properties so that they can provide the board of directors and the C-suite that are evaluating not only whether they should purchase it, but what price they should offer for those assets, that they have a more sophisticated and an updated skill set so they're making a higher quality decision about whether they should buy those entities or not.
Yeah, it's absolutely about visibility into what you are acquiring and understanding the risk profile that they're bringing to the table up and down the stack. And so therefore you can make that informed decision. I think it goes back to the informed pricing model that we were just talking about. You know, what kind of pricing do you want to purchase that activity?
I think probably the thing I would just wrap up is very much like most of you have got a very strong technical and cyber background, but I think we need to remember that at the C-suite and the board level, they talk more in terms of risk than they do specific, like tactics or threats. So I would just encourage everyone to just spend a little time elevating the way they frame the conversation and focus more on risk and a little bit less on the technical aspects of the concerns you might have.
For spending the time today to come in and learn about what we're talking about. I'll mirror what Jeff said, and really what we're trying to highlight here, and get cyber and technical folks really aligned with the business. And so we're trying to really help all of us manage that risk and be able to talk the right languages. So again, if you have any remarks, comments, want to talk, we're all available to talk with you.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Greg?
Thanks, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And to echo again what Jeremy and Jeff have already said, if in doubt, guys, shout out. We're definitely here to answer the questions that you have and to facilitate you throughout the process if need be.
All right, thank you, Greg. So Tony, thank you very much for your efforts in pulling the group together and helping us present the webinar. I really appreciate that. Thank you to our partnership with Taurseer as well as RiskNeutral. This has been a project that we've been working on together for several months now. It's finally come to fruition, and I think we've put together a good story here of how why you would need this type of collaborative effort from the compliance to the risk to the platform. And we really look forward to seeing you guys next month when the HOW presentation occurs.